Hi, souls. I'm glad to have you here today. So, what brought you here? Are you wondering to yourself, what is trauma? Let me just ask you, when you hear the word trauma, what comes to your mind? Is it a horrific car accident? A freak accident? Maybe trauma is witnessing or experiencing something sudden, catastrophic, or tragic. When we think of trauma, most recognize trauma only when it arrives loudly, when there is a single moment we can pinpoint and say, that was it. Like the ending of Romeo and Juliet, where a chain of miscommunication culminates in sudden, preventable deaths, where young lives end abruptly and the trauma is immediate, irreversible, and final. Or maybe like the ending of the Titanic, where a single catastrophic event shatters thousands of lives at once, where survival and loss are decided in moments, and the trauma is immediate, overwhelming, and final. But did you know that many of the most enduring forms of trauma enter quietly? Stay curious and listen to what will unfold in today's chapter. I'd like to now welcome you to Inner Library Alignment. I am Rachel Golden. I am the magical and luminous voice behind this space. I am here to remind you that you are both the librarian and the author of your life. And this is a space to wander the stacks of your soul, revise your stories, to align and rediscover your light. In this chapter, we step into a section of the inner library that few people are taught how to navigate. These are shelves that remain closed, misfiled, or deliberately avoided, not because the stories are dramatic, but because they were never given language. Trauma does not always arrive as a catastrophe. Often it settles in as an unfinished volume, a book without a call number, a story shelved without context because it did not feel safe to read it at the time. Trauma is not defined by weakness or failure. It is defined by overwhelm, by the moment when an experience exceeds the nervous system's capacity to process, integrate, and return to safety. In library terms, trauma is not the event itself. It is the book that never completed cataloging. The text exists, but without authorship, order, or resolution. And today we are not here to relive trauma. We are here to understand it, so it no longer silently organizes your inner shelves. And let's talk about what trauma is. What feels bad is often a matter of perspective. Trauma isn't about how something looks on the outside or how dramatic the cover appears. Two people can move through the same chapter, and one may turn the page while the other gets stuck rereading it. The difference often comes down to whether they felt safe, supported, and understood while the story was unfolding. Trauma forms when the body perceives threat, and there is no avenue for escape, expression, or repair. And this is why trauma does not behave like a well-edited autobiography. It behaves like a fragmented manuscript stored in sensation, posture, breath, and reflex rather than a coherent narrative. And in the book, The Body Keeps the Score, the body continues to hold unfinished chapters long after the mind believes the story is over. The body keeps the index even when the narrative memory fades. To bring order to the inner library, we must clearly classify and identify the trauma collection. Trauma is not a single volume with a single storyline, and to make sense of how it shows up in our lives, let's first identify and classify the trauma collection. First, let's talk about acute trauma. It arrives as a sudden plot rupture, a single overwhelming event that tears the narrative open. Just think of a serious car accident, a sudden medical emergency, or witnessing an unexpected death. One moment that fractures life into a clear before and after. And then let's talk about chronic trauma. It reads like a recurring series, ongoing exposure to instability, emotional neglect, or unpredictability, where there is no single chapter to point to, only a pattern that repeats. Think of it like this: growing up in a household marked by constant conflict, addiction, or emotional unavailability, where the nervous system never fully stands down. And let's talk about complex trauma. It often forms in early relationships where care and fear coexist and love is paired with inconsistency or silence. These texts shape how the entire library is organized. I'll give you an example. Being raised by a caregiver who is sometimes nurturing and sometimes frightening, leaving the child constantly scanning for cues of safety or withdrawal. And now let's talk about developmental trauma. It occurs while the nervous system is still under construction. The architecture adapts for survival, but the structure reflects what it had to endure. For example, early childhood experiences of neglect, chronic stress, or repeated invalidation during key developmental windows before the child has language or agency to make sense of what is happening. And now let's discuss intergenerational trauma, also known as ancestral trauma, and in some cultures or communities, generational curse. It consists of inherited volumes, stories passed down through behavior, silence, and unresolved grief. You did not write these books, but you were handed them nonetheless. For example, patterns of fear, scarcity, racialized harm, or emotional suppression pass from one generation to the next without being named or processed. And then let's talk about systemic trauma. It arrives as a structural imprint, harm produced not by a single event or relationship, but by institutions and policies that repeatedly expose individuals or communities to danger, exclusion, or dehumanization. For example, growing up within racialized systems, gendered systems, colonial or post-colonial systems, and poverty enforced through policy. And finally, there is vicarious or secondary trauma, and it reads like a story observed through proximity, formed through repeated exposure to the suffering of others, even when the harm is not experienced directly. For example, children who witness abuse in the home, or caregivers and educators who hold others' pain over time until those stories quietly imprint on their own nervous system. I want to emphasize, trauma does not require direct harm. It can form through witnessing. When a child grows up observing abuse, addiction, racism, neglect, or exclusion, the nervous system still records threat. The child learns what love looks like, what safety costs, and which truths are allowed to exist. Children read environments the way librarians read collections. They notice which stories are protected, which are displayed, and which are quietly removed. No explanation is necessary. The pattern teaches them everything. This kind of trauma often goes unnamed, yet it profoundly shapes beliefs about belonging, worth, and safety. There is a volume in my own inner library that I did not write, but it shaped how I understood belonging from a very young age. As far back as I can remember, my maternal grandmother existed in my life as a story before she ever existed as a person. I grew up hearing about her Native American roots, her presence, her importance, and I also heard about my grandfather, which was her first husband, a Black man who died while serving in the military. I never met either of them, and as young as 3 years old, I remember longing to see my grandmother, to meet her, to know her, to understand where I came from. She lived in my imagination as kind of a missing volume in the family library, referenced often but never made available to me. And by the time I was 6, I learned more about my grandmother and my Aunt Jerry, whom I also never met, and how she lived at home with my grandmother. At the time, I did not understand why this relationship existed while others did not. I simply accepted it as part of the landscape of my family. It came to surface when I heard my mother speak about my Aunt Jerry with a particular reverence, repeatedly emphasizing that she was half Mexican. That detail was never casual. It was highlighted, admired, and returned to again and again as though it explained something essential. And when my Aunt Jerry grew up, married, and had children of her own, the pattern became unmistakable. I remember the celebration surrounding my cousins, their blonde hair, their blue eyes. I remember my grandmother's visible pride and how central she was in their lives. She was not distant or symbolic. She was present. She showed up. She claimed them. They were included. They belonged. And in that contrast between the grandmother I longed for and never met and the grandmother I watched fully embrace others, I learned without being taught. No one named the rule out loud, but the family library made it legible. My Aunt Jerry had a Mexican father, not a Black one, and the children she had with her white husband were raised within my grandmother's home. They occupied space freely. They were woven into her daily life. And by witnessing love extended consistently in one direction and withheld in another, the logic of belonging became unmistakably clear. Take your highlighters and highlight these lines of today's chapter. Experiences that cannot be safely named or processed do not disappear. They are pushed into the shadowed stacks of the psyche, unlabeled, unresolved, yet still active. They return as emotional reactivity, attachment patterns, and beliefs that feel deeply personal but are not. The body carries these volumes as vigilance, tension, and expectation. It prepares for rejection before it happens. It learns to brace instead of trust. This is not dysfunction. It is an intelligent adaptation. Healing begins when these books are named correctly and placed in context, relational, historical, and systemic, rather than misfiled as personal failure. Trauma is not the story. It is the unfinished draft. Healing does not erase books from the inner library. It recatalogs them. It restores context. It returns authorship. And when trauma is integrated, the book remains, but it no longer hijacks every chapter that follows. The story stops repeating itself unconsciously and becomes something we can hold with clarity and choice. Trauma does not mean you are broken. It means your system adapted to what it was given. In the inner library, healing is not about forgetting. It is about shelving truthfully so the past no longer organizes the present. And what trauma leaves behind is not just memory. It leaves behind beliefs, quiet conclusion the mind and body make in order to survive. Beliefs about safety, about worth, about love, about what must be endured and what cannot be expected. In our next chapter, we'll turn to those belief systems, the internal rules written in response to trauma, and examine how they were formed, how they continue to shape perception and behavior, and how they can be revised once they are brought into the conscious awareness. Until then, keep gently tending to your shelves. Notice which beliefs feel inherited rather than chosen. Those are often the next books asking to be read. If this message resonates, share it with someone who is ready to align, and subscribe so you can continue redefining your inner library alongside me. Keep aligning your books and your stories, one book, one chapter, one page, one line, and one golden truth at a time.